I'm writing this under an anonymous throwaway account because I don't want any real-life connections stumbling upon my story. It's not that I'm ashamed, but I've been lurking on Reddit for years, and I know how quickly stories can go viral. Let me get straight to the point. My younger sister Clara stole our late mom's jewelry, pieces that held immense sentimental and financial value, and sold them for $10,000. Then she turned around and gave that money to our 80-year-old grandmother as some sort of flashy gift, presumably to prove she's the generous granddaughter who cares. Meanwhile, I've spent most of my adult life looking after Grandma, funding everything from her medical bills to her daily groceries, never once expecting a medal or even a thank you from Clara. I'll start with a bit of context about my family. My mother passed away 2 years ago. She left behind a small house, some personal belongings, and that box of jewelry she'd inherited from her own mother, our grandmother. It wasn't an enormous fortune, but several of the pieces were heirlooms from multiple generations. Mom had made it clear that the jewelry was to be split evenly between Clara and me. She also specified that if we ever wanted to sell anything, we should do it together, so we'd both benefit equally. That was Mom's final wish, and she trusted us to honor it. After the funeral, I thought it best to store the jewelry in a safe deposit box at the bank, especially since Clara was already making statements like, "We should cash this out now." I convinced her it would be safer and more respectful to wait at least a year. She agreed. At least, that's what she told me. I should have known better than to trust her completely, because Clara's track record with money is abysmal. Over the last decade, she's racked up credit card debt and borrowed money from family members without ever repaying them. She's even asked me for rent when she couldn't keep a stable job. I've bailed her out multiple times. Still, I worried. When the year mark rolled around, I mentioned to Clara that we should finally sit down and decide which pieces we'd keep as heirlooms and which ones we might consider selling. She looked uncomfortable and mumbled something about wanting to wait a bit longer. I didn't push it because I'd just come out of a stressful work project, and honestly, jewelry was the last thing on my mind. I figured I'd give her a couple more months to process everything. Mom's death was hard on both of us, and although we grieved in very different ways, I wanted to be patient. If I'd known then what I know now, I'd have stormed into that bank vault and checked every single piece without delay. Instead, I continued with my routine, working, visiting Grandma, making sure her bills were paid, and dropping off groceries whenever I could. My grandmother is old, but she's sharp. She knows how to stretch a dollar, and she hates fussing over material things. The only person who visits her besides me is Clara, though my sister mostly shows up to flaunt her new purchases or to guilt Grandma into praising her life choices. Then she leaves before any real conversation can happen. One day, I got a call from my aunt who lives out of state. She said Grandma had called her in tears, talking about how Clara had given her a massive gift of $10,000. Grandma was confused and kept insisting she couldn't accept such generosity. My aunt wanted to know if I'd heard anything about this. I was floored. Clara had never held down a job that would pay her enough to save 10 grand. She was perpetually broke. I assured my aunt I'd look into it. Right after that call, I texted Clara asking if we could talk. She didn't reply for 2 days. When she finally did, she acted casual and suggested we meet at Grandma's place. I drove over the next afternoon, expecting some sort of explanation. Instead, I walked in to find Clara telling Grandma that she wanted nothing. In return for her gift, just love and gratitude. Grandma seemed overwhelmed, stammering about how she couldn't possibly accept that much money from her granddaughter. I waited until Clara finished her theatrical speech, then I asked, "So, where did you get $10,000? Clara glared at me. She tried to laugh it off and said she came into some money recently, but wouldn't elaborate. Meanwhile, Grandma kept insisting she'd give the money back. I stepped into the kitchen with Clara and demanded a real explanation. That's when she admitted, a bit too casually, that she'd sold some of Mom's jewelry. My heart hammered in my chest. I asked how much she sold and why she'd done it without telling me. She shrugged and said she needed quick cash. Then she claimed she'd sold only a fraction of the collection. I was livid. I reminded her of Mom's explicit instructions. She rolled her eyes and said, "Mom's dead and she doesn't need the jewelry. Why should it sit in a box when we could use the money?" I felt sick to my stomach. I told her she had no right to sell anything without my consent. She shot back that since it was half hers, she could do what she wanted with her share. I couldn't believe how cold she was. Furious, I left the house, telling Grandma I'd be back later. I drove straight to the bank, opened the safe deposit box, and counted every piece. Multiple necklaces, rings, and a gold bracelet were missing. Not just one or two items, but a huge portion of what Mom left behind. I called Clara repeatedly. She wouldn't pick up. Over the next few days, she dodged my calls and only sent a few texts saying she was too stressed to deal with this. I contacted the jewelry store she mentioned in passing once, hoping to find out if they'd bought items from her. They confirmed they'd purchased a gold bracelet and 2 rings from someone matching Clara's description, but refused to give more info without legal paperwork. I was furious, but fury alone wasn't enough. I needed a plan. My biggest concern was the rest of the jewelry. Had she sold even more somewhere else? I couldn't risk her cleaning out everything before I could stop her, so I moved the jewelry to a different safe deposit box at another bank, one where Clara had zero access. Then I hired a lawyer. I was done with the back and forth. Mom's estate wasn't massive, but it was enough that legal counsel felt justified. I explained the situation, provided the will, and asked what my options were. The lawyer told me that since the will explicitly stated how the jewelry should be handled, and Clara had violated that, I might have grounds for legal action. But lawsuits are messy and expensive. Also, there's the possibility a court might rule that Clara only owed me half of the sale's value, since technically half the jewelry was hers. The lawyer advised me to gather as much evidence as possible before making any moves. I was seething, but I needed a clearer plan for revenge. Simply suing Clara might lead nowhere. Or worse, it could drag on and cost me a fortune in legal fees. And if I did win, I'd likely end up with a judgment that Clara couldn't pay. She was already in debt. She had no real assets. I'd be left with nothing but legal bills. So I decided to approach this differently. Over the years, I'd shouldered all of Grandma's expenses without complaint. Clara never contributed a dime. She swooped in with flashy gestures, like this so-called $10,000 gift, to look good in Grandma's eyes. But day to day, I'm the one who keeps Grandma's life running smoothly. And Clara pretended she was the hero. That stung, but I also recognized an opportunity. Grandma didn't want Clara's money. She kept insisting she would give it back. That's when I realized I could turn Clara's fake generosity into her downfall. I encouraged Grandma to keep the money for now, saying it might be useful for her medical costs. Secretly, I planned to expose Clara for who she really was. First, I contacted that jewelry store again and asked if they'd be willing to let me see any receipts matching the dates I suspected. They refused outright. I didn't have a subpoena, and they wouldn't budge without one. Next, I tried another angle. Clara is notoriously careless with her digital footprint. I knew she kept online banking apps on her phone and rarely bothered with strong passwords. I wouldn't stoop to hacking her, but I did recall that she'd once used my laptop and forgot to log out of her email. Unfortunately, I'd long since logged her out, so that was a dead end. But I did know that Clara loved to brag on social media. I decided to quietly watch her profiles for any mention of new purchases or suspicious spending. Sure enough, a week later, she posted about buying a designer handbag and going on a spa day. Comments rolled in congratulating her on her sudden financial luck. She played it coy, saying she'd come into some cash, but didn't specify how. It was infuriating. Meanwhile, Grandma kept asking me if she should really keep the $10,000. I told her to hold on to it for now. She agreed, albeit reluctantly. Clara made a big show of telling everyone what a huge sacrifice she'd made and how she was just so happy to help Grandma out. I could barely stand it. Finally, after waiting a couple weeks, I decided to set the trap. I invited Clara to meet me at my apartment, telling her we needed to discuss the rest of Mom's belongings. She showed up, acting irritated, like she was doing me a favor by coming over. I told her straight up that I wanted to finalize our share of the jewelry, and that if she planned to sell anything else, it had to be done through me and split fairly. She scoffed and said she didn't need my permission, but I calmly reminded her of Mom's will. Then I informed her I'd moved the remaining pieces to a more secure location. She went pale. That's when it clicked. She must have been planning to steal more. I added that I'd hired a lawyer and was prepared to press charges if any more items went missing. She exploded, calling me a control freak and saying Mom would have wanted her to have that money to live a better life. I let her rant, and once she calmed down, I quietly said, "You sold a good chunk of the jewelry already, and I'd be well within my rights to take legal action. But I won't on one condition: you confess everything to Grandma and return the $10,000 you gave her." Clara looked stunned. She said, "But that was her gift. I can't just take it back." I replied, "Well, you shouldn't have stolen the jewelry in the first place. If you want to avoid a court case, you'll do exactly as I say." She stormed out, yelling that she'd never bow to my bullying. I let her leave, expecting she'd cool down and realize she was cornered. But days passed, and she didn't call or text. I checked Grandma often, making sure Clara hadn't tried anything else. Then one evening, Clara burst into Grandma's house while I was there, screaming about how I'd threatened her. She demanded Grandma take her side. Grandma looked frightened and confused. I calmly repeated that Clara had sold Mom's jewelry without my permission and that she owed me half of that money at minimum. Grandma went pale, realizing the full extent. Clara then turned on me, saying I was greedy for wanting my half. I told her that wasn't the point. The point was, she stole from me and from Mom's legacy. Grandma started crying. She said she didn't want this money if it came from something so tainted. She offered to write Clara a check for the full amount just to keep the peace, but I interjected, telling Grandma not to do that. Clara glared at me, realized she wouldn't get a dime of that 10 grand back without returning the stolen funds to me as well. I left the house shortly after, telling them both that I'd had enough drama for one night. Clara called me later that evening, crying and begging me not to ruin her life with a lawsuit. I stated calmly that my conditions stood. She agreed to work something out, but I didn't trust her at all. I was determined to see this through. The next day, I contacted my lawyer again and outlined everything that had happened. He advised sending Clara a formal notice demanding payment for half the value of the jewelry sold, along with a cease and desist regarding any further sale of inherited items. We drafted the letter, had it notarized, and sent it via certified mail. Clara received it a few days later. She called me in a panic, saying she'd do whatever it took to avoid going to court. I told her that was fine, but she had to meet my conditions by a certain deadline. She claimed she didn't have the 10 grand anymore, which was obviously a lie because she'd given that money to Grandma and Grandma hadn't spent it. But it turned out Clara had spent a big chunk of her own cut on herself after the sale, so she was strapped for cash again. Typical Clara, blowing everything on luxuries. I didn't care. I told her that was her problem to solve. A few days passed without a word. Then, out of nowhere, Grandma called me, saying Clara had returned to her the following day, sobbing and asking for the $10,000 back, claiming it was an emergency. Grandma refused to give it to her, saying she wouldn't take part in the dishonesty. Clara broke down, admitting she'd stolen the jewelry. Grandma told me she felt sorry for Clara, but also betrayed. She asked if I could just forgive Clara for the family's sake, but I refused. Mom always emphasized fairness, and Clara had violated that in a huge way. I told Grandma I'd do what needed to be done. If Clara wanted mercy, she could earn it by telling the truth and making amends. Nothing less would satisfy me. I wasn't going to forgive her just for the sake of family unity. I'd invested too much of my own time, money, and emotional energy into caring for Grandma, and I'd honored Mom's wishes while Clara spit on them. So, no, I wouldn't just roll over. The lawyer's letter gave Clara a deadline of 2 weeks to respond with a plan for repayment. The next days were tense. Clara tried to convince me to drop the whole thing multiple times, saying she'd find a way to pay me back eventually. I didn't budge. I told her she needed to return the money she'd given Grandma, plus my share of whatever she sold the rest for. She whined that I was being heartless. I reminded her that she'd stolen from me. No apologies had ever come from her, only excuses and blame. With the deadline approaching, Clara finally relented. She showed up at my apartment with tears in her eyes, saying she was willing to sign an agreement to pay me back in monthly installments. I laughed bitterly and told her I'd need a down payment immediately, plus a cosigner, because I didn't trust her to make regular payments. She wailed that she didn't have anyone who could co-sign for her. I said that was too bad. I wouldn't accept anything less. I'm sure some people might think I was going too far, but I felt no remorse. She'd made her bed, and I was no longer interested in softening the consequences for her. That same day, I showed her a draft of the complaint I'd have my lawyer file if she refused my terms. She burst into hysterics, claiming I'd destroy her future. I didn't blink. She stomped out. I figured that was that. But 2 days later, she called me and said she'd do it. She had an old high school friend who was willing to co-sign if it meant avoiding a lawsuit. She scraped together $5,000 for an initial payment, borrowed from who knows where. I drew up a contract with my lawyer, spelling out the exact terms. She owed me half the final sale price of all jewelry she'd sold, plus interest and legal fees. If she defaulted, I'd have the right to pursue a lien on any property she might own in the future and sue her friend as well. She balked at the clause about her friend, but I held firm. I'm not usually this ruthless, but I'd reached my limit with Clara. She signed the paperwork. Her friend co-signed, looking visibly nervous. I made a photocopy of their IDs, had everything notarized, then gave Clara a receipt for the $5,000 down payment. She was shaking the whole time, her eyes red from crying. I almost felt a twinge of pity, but then I remembered how she'd casually stolen a piece of our family's history for a few quick bucks. That sympathy evaporated. Over the next few months, Clara made her monthly payments. She had to get a second job to afford them, and from what I heard through family gossip, she was struggling. Good. I'm not a monster, but I'm also not going to pretend I'm sorry she's facing the consequences of her own selfishness. Meanwhile, Grandma still has the $10,000 in a separate account. She wanted to give it back to me, but I insisted she keep it for herself. After all, she's the one I've been taking care of all these years, and she deserves that financial cushion. Clara doesn't dare ask for that money back now. If she does, I can easily amend the contract to reflect an even bigger debt. As it stands, she owes me a hefty sum that will take her years to pay off. And I haven't forgiven her. I don't plan to. She betrayed me, betrayed our mother, and tried to pass it off as some grand gesture of love to Grandma. That's unforgivable in my book. Family or not, I've learned my lesson. I no longer trust Clara with anything remotely valuable. I see her only at family gatherings. Sometimes she tries to play nice, acting like nothing ever happened. I keep it civil for Grandma's sake, but there's no warmth between us. She blew that bridge up the moment she decided to sell Mom's jewelry. It's been a while since all this went down, and I've come to terms with the fact that some heirlooms might be gone forever. I try not to dwell on it. I've taken the rest of the jewelry and locked it away, safe from Clara. Grandma and I still have a close bond. She feels guilty for the friction in the family, but I assure her it's not her fault. She was just a pawn in Clara's manipulative game. As for Clara, she's slowly chipping away at her debt. Every time I get a payment notification, I'm reminded of how she tried to cheat me and ended up stuck paying way more than she would have if she'd been honest. My cousins have asked me if I'll ever forgive Clara once this is all behind us. Honestly, I doubt it. She showed me exactly who she is when she saw nothing wrong with stealing from our mother's inheritance. Even if she pays every last cent, there's no erasing the betrayal. I'll remain civil for Grandma, but that's where it ends. Revenge, in my eyes, doesn't always have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just ensuring the other person faces the consequences of their actions and sees what they've lost. That's what happened here. Clara lost my trust, lost her free ride, and now she's effectively in debt to me for the foreseeable future. She gets no sympathy from me, and I certainly don't regret making her life harder. She made her choice when she betrayed me and Mom. To anyone reading this who might think I'm cruel, I get it. But you weren't the one who had your mother's last wishes trampled on, who saw your sibling profit off sentimental items that can never be replaced. You also didn't watch your grandmother get dragged into it so someone could pretend to be the generous granddaughter.